All right, can I just ask everyone to turn off their audio and their videos just as a matter of housekeeping so that we can keep the connection stable as long as possible. If you do get kicked out, just join in again. We'll keep an eye on the waiting room to make sure that everyone's able to join. One of us will be keeping an eye on the waiting room to make sure that people are able to come in. So this is a workshop on creating a research data management plan. This is run in conjunction between the Division for Postgraduate Studies, and I'm the rep from there. And then we've also got Sarah Schaefer from the eResearch Office and Mark Snyders from the library. So you've got a couple of different perspectives sharing today. So yeah, we're going to be using the chat function primarily for questions. And then if you have time later on for a more interactive Q&A, we'll have that as well. So if you do have questions as we're going along, please type them in the chat. So the point of this workshop today is looking at how to create a research data management plan. And as a lot of our students will know, research is not just about doing research. There's a lot of admin that goes in behind that, with writing ethics clearance documents and proposals. And data management is another part of those almost administrative processes that go along hand in hand with the research process. And this is part of making sure that you're protecting your participants and how you're actually protecting the data that they give you as part of the research process. So this goes hand in hand with ethical issues of consent, confidentiality, and anonymity. And so what your data management plan is essentially the practical tools that you're going to be using to be able to keep track of who has access to that information and how you're protecting your participants in that way. So we're going to be going through some background information that sets up why data management is important and what that looks like, and then also a practical demonstration of how to do this. Can I ask everyone to please mute? Sorry, got a little bit confused there with the meeting. We're hoping this will be about 2 hours long, should be done by 1 o'clock. But again, that depends on how many questions there are that come up. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to do the first part of the presentation for us.
Thanks, Janine. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I am the Research Data Management Specialist at the eResearch at UWC's eResearch. I work very closely with the library, and my colleague Mark is going to do the second part of this presentation. I'm going to jump straight in. I'm going to turn my video off while I present. And yeah, as Janine said, if there are questions during the presentation, please pop them into the chat and we'll address them afterwards. Thanks. Okay. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to start by looking at research and research data. I'm sure I don't need to be the person to tell any of you that research is vitally important for a million different reasons. As a researcher, you are contributing to the knowledge economy of South Africa and globally. And the management of research data has become part of the research process, often whether researchers like it or not, and it affects the quality of the research outcome. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with a lot of the content I'm going to go through, but I think it's useful to look at it all as a whole before going into more detail about data management planning later. Okay, we're going to jump straight into looking at what is known as the research lifecycle. This is a very simplified lifecycle diagram, but you can see that the process of research usually follows a sequential path, starting at the top with idea discovery or the generation of a hypothesis. This is followed by an approval stage, where researchers look for funding, write proposals, get approval. Next is doing the actual research. Followed by dissemination. After dissemination, new ideas will be formed, data will be reused, and the cycle begins again. As all of you researchers know, this is a simplified diagram, but it will hopefully serve its purpose here. Now, where in the cycle does data come into the picture? Importantly, it's not only at the conducting research stage, even though that may be where most of the raw or primary data will be generated. Data is actually present at every step of the research lifecycle shown here. So during idea discovery, the researcher decides on the way the data will be collected and what data instruments will be used. This is the planning stage, and it's where researchers decide on their instruments, their study populations, etc. They're planning for the data that they're going to generate. During funding and approval, the researcher focuses on the cost of data collection and data storage. This is the proposal or grant approval stage, and where the researcher is thinking about the costs of data collection and storage in the short and the long term. During conducting research, the active stage of research, this is where the researcher will collect data, store it, and start analyzing it. This is the active phase, so a lot of the data work happens here, as you can expect. During disseminating results, the researcher would publish and share data in a repository and make it available with a license for other researchers to view and reuse. All of this shows that data needs attention throughout the research lifecycle. It's not something that should just be touched once because it's a funder or a publisher requirement. It's important that data is managed throughout the lifecycle and beyond. Okay, so we're going to take one step further back and ask, what is data? We can see data here at the bottom of the triangle, known as the DIKW triangle, or the knowledge hierarchy model. Data is information in its most basic form. It is the foundation. It is unrefined information. On its own, data doesn't necessarily have meaning. It needs to be processed, which is why it forms the basis for information, knowledge, and wisdom. And that's where the researchers come in. So what is research data? Simply put, it's data that is being used for the sake of research. This includes data that is derived from observation, experiment, interviews, testing, hypotheses, surveys, etc. Research data can be qualitative or quantitative. Research data can include data sets, numbers, opinions, sound recordings, video recordings, images. Different disciplines collect different types of data. Some data can be recollected and others can't be. For example, observations of people can't be simply recollected, but carefully conducted lab experiments can. So in a nutshell, there are no set rules for what research data, what is constituted by the data. So on that, we're going to look at another lifecycle model. It's known as the research data lifecycle. And hopefully this illustrates how research data fits into the research process and how the research data has a life cycle of its own within the research cycle. If my next slide comes up, okay. Okay, as you can see again, this is a simplified model, but it also shows the sequential nature of the cycle. From planning research at the top and moving clockwise to reusing data. So we're going to look at the activities that relate to the stages of the data lifecycle. In the first stage, planning research, researchers need to start planning for the management of their data. This includes writing a proposal, thinking about their paradigm, their approaches, the costs. This point also includes data management plans. These specify what kind of data will be produced, the methodologies, the plans for storage and access and preservation, any documentation that goes along with it, any restrictions, ethics clearance and IP, and other costs. It's all about being upfront about your research data plans. The next stage, well, it's actually the next two stages, collecting data and processing and analyzing. I'm going to talk about those together because those are the active phase of research here. And it includes collecting, processing, and analyzing data. It's where researchers use local storage that is secure and reliable and ensures that there are regular backups. It's where researchers make sure that they use file formats that are widely used for the sake of later sharing, and formats that are non-proprietary and open. Researchers use file names and versioning that are descriptive and consistent. They use a folder structure that is logical and descriptive metadata. The next point in the cycle is the sharing and publishing of data, where researchers would deposit their data to an appropriate repository. They would anonymize data if needed. They would define access terms and conditions and identify embargo periods if necessary, and choose licenses that are as open as possible. In the next stage, preserving data. This is about the long-term storage and preservation of data, where researchers choose which data to retain, if any, where they choose a logical and secure home that will ensure accessibility and preservation, where they would migrate to newer formats if and when needed, and arrange disposable if and when necessary. And lastly, the reusing data stage, where researchers would assign a unique identifier to their data, where they would track access and reappraise the data at the end of the retention period. Okay, so these life cycles, and especially the research data life cycle, fits into what we call research data management, or RDM. I'm going to refer to it as RDM here. In a nutshell, RDM concerns the active management and appraisal of data from its entry in the research cycle through to the dissemination and archiving of results. Good research data management is an essential part of research, and it's becoming more and more relevant and necessary. And I'm sure you've all heard the term RDM spoken about more and more over the last few years. RDM is important to the ongoing production and dissemination of knowledge, as well as South Africa's research agenda. Researchers are expected to practice good RDM and use RDM tools in order to streamline their workflows and to make their research more efficient and more visible. Sharing research data is a part of practicing good RDM. As I've shown with the previous lifecycle models, data have a longer lifespan than the research project that creates them. Researchers may continue to work on data after funding has ceased. Follow-up projects may analyze or add to the data, and data may be reused by other researchers. This use and reuse of data is only possible when data is shared, managed well, properly preserved, and made available. Well-organized, well-documented, preserved, and shared data are invaluable to advance scientific inquiry and to increase opportunities for learning and innovation and collaboration. Research is becoming more open worldwide, and data sharing across disciplines and fields is becoming the norm. Kikapo is UWC's institutional data repository. It is powered by Figshare, and it is a cloud-based platform for securely publishing and sharing research data while making it discoverable and citable. UWC doesn't mandate the use of Kikapo, but we strongly encourage it, as it makes data curation far easier for researchers and for research support, and we can offer training and assistance where needed. All UWC students and staff can access the system with their novel credentials. Using Kikapo to store and share your data means that you can store your outputs in any file format. It means you can securely collaborate with researchers from other institutions. It means that you can get a citable digital object identifier for public outputs. You can demonstrate impact with altmetrics and other similar things. There is open access, which is very valuable for funder compliance, and can help others discover your outputs on Google Scholar. Kikapo, well, Figshare and therefore Kikapo is what is known as ISO 27001 compliant, which means it adheres to a framework of policies and procedures that includes all legal and technical controls involved in an organization's information risk management processes. Researchers can get a DOI, a digital object identifier, for uploaded digital objects. And this is a persistent identifier, and it's a unique link. DOIs are more permanent than standard URLs and ensure that the source will always be able to be reliably located. Using Kikapo doesn't mean that all research data has to be completely open, but it rather means that we support all data being as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Using Kikapo makes it easier for researchers to make their data more open, and it also makes it easier for researchers to use what are referred to as the FAIR data principles, which we're going to look at next. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and I'll go through each one of those quickly. So these are, the FAIR principles are 4 foundational principles that are used as guidelines. They relate to data and metadata, and they are domain agnostic. Data curation aims to make data fair for as long as it's considered useful. Actively managing data. RDM incorporates practices and processes for effective data curation. Okay, so the findability principle. This is about making sure that data is stored with a persistent identifier, like the DOI I spoke about earlier, that the data is well described with rich metadata and indexed in as many relevant searchable resources as appropriate. This allows data to always be found by a single URL despite any changes or migrations, and promotes its discovery across multiple platforms. All data published through Kikapo are assigned a DOI, which aids this discoverability. And all data published through Kikapo are indexed by major search engines and Google Dataset Search, as well as a number of community and national data registers. The accessibility principle ensures that data can be accessed via standard non-proprietary protocols, and metadata is stored in perpetuity. This allows the simple access of data now and future-proofs the provenance of data in the event that it can't be stored long-term due to storage limitations. This accessibility principle also means that data will never be behind a paywall, and it integrates with a number of long-term preservation systems. Okay, next is interoperability. This principle promotes the use of formal, accessible, shared, and broadly accepted language for knowledge representation. This allows metadata and data to be accessed and retrieved in a number of different formats and promotes the free flow of data between systems. The reusability principle encourages researchers to upload metadata and data that are richly described to the domain relevant community standards. All metadata and data on Figshare have a clear and accessible usage license. So Kikapo makes it easy to adhere to these FAIR principles, which might seem daunting if this is the first time you're hearing about them. But if you're using a reliable platform like Figshare or Kikapo, then being able to adhere to these principles will be easy. Okay, UWC has a research data management policy, which I'll touch on quickly here. In a nutshell, our RDM policy encourages all researchers at UWC to practice good RDM and to submit a data management plan as a part of this. Increasingly, publishers, international funders, and our NRF require that research data supporting project and publications be made publicly available. The NRF released a statement on open access in 2015, asserting that the results of publicly funded research should be published as open access. Moreover, the data supporting the research should be made available in an accredited open access data repository with the provision of DOIs for citation purposes. In order to achieve these things, researchers need to practice good RDM throughout the research lifecycle. Also relevant to RDM is the POPI Act. The protection of personal information. I'm sure that none of us here are strangers to hearing about the POPI Act since it kicked in nationally on the 1st of July and all of our inboxes filled up. The POPI Act is South Africa's equivalent of the European GDPR. It sets conditions for responsible parties to lawfully process the personal information of data subjects. The POPI Act is extremely relevant to all researchers as it applies to research activities that involve identifiable personal information of individuals or organizations. Any participant of research has a right to privacy, and this is not just a POPI Act obligation, but it's also an integral part of research ethics. Any research conducted that includes personal subject information will be required to submit a DMP, a data management plan, at the point of application for research ethics approval. Overall, the POPI Act is welcomed as it gives greater guidance to researchers regarding the use and protection of personal information for research purposes. This should serve to improve transparency, accountability, and oversight in the processing of personal information and promote public trust in the use of personal information in research contexts. My colleague from the library, Mark Snyders, is going to take over from here, and he's going to talk in more detail about what goes into data management planning and writing a data management plan, a DMP. Sorry, my slides are going all over. These are a couple of references that I've used for this presentation. Thank you all for listening. You can see my email address here is Schaefer, as well as UWC's RDM support email address. And you can access more information about what I spoke about and RDM on the eResearch website. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's my turn now. So good morning, everyone. It's still morning, and I trust everyone is having a nice Monday. Okay, so just before we start, there were a few questions in the chat. One of them in particular was, we'll start with Kikapo since that was the most recently dealt with. Kikapo, as Sarah said, is our research data management repository. And what we have, and in terms of the question was, is Kikapo fully open or does it allow restricted access? Kikapo does allow for restricted access. The default setting, as I responded in the chat, the default setting is private. So anything that goes up and you do not request any kind of publication, it remains private and it remains accessible only to yourself as the either principal investigator or researcher, it's individual researcher, etc. The data only becomes public when you ask for it, to be made public, and after a consultation service, after a brief consultation, which will involve some data curation concerns, and you are satisfied, or you and I are satisfied that, as well as any other, as supervisors, for example, are satisfied that the data can be made public, then we can make it public. As far as the library is concerned, I am the manager for scholarly communication, and I am the administrator for Kikapo. So if you do request publication of your research data, that request will come to my desk. Okay, we had in terms of the FAIR data principles, I've put up the link for the original site where FAIR data principles were first identified. And there was another question with regard to DERISA. So I have responded, but for anyone who is not clear on that, let's just go back. As far as DERISA is concerned, it is the acronym for the data. It's referred to as the Data Research Initiative of South Africa. The name on the website is a bit odd because it was actually referred to as originally as the Digital Research Initiative of South Africa. However, it is a service provided by the National Department. And what has happened is, so the National Department of Science and Innovation, among the services that they offer are help with creating a data management plan, as well as help with depositing research data. So whereas at UWC, we encourage people to deposit research data, not primarily Figshare, my apologies, not primarily, we will get to that in a second, but there are other services available. For astronomy and astrophysics, for example, there is something called ArchiveX. And there are also various biotechnology data repositories available as well. The reason why I've mentioned those is because with biotechnology and data collected and used by SANBI, the SA National Biodiversity Institute, sorry, as well as astrophysics and astronomy. The reason why I mentioned the other databases is because those fields in particular use databases that collect terabytes of research data. Kikapo does not have the ability to create, this does not have the ability to store that kind of information. Those are typically the kind of data is significant and actually requires a special machine and a special storage facility. That is something that UWC will deal with at a later stage. But for everybody else, where the data that you collect is less than a terabyte or less than 50 megabytes, for a number of data sets, it's actually going to be quite small unless your data includes audiovisual material. What will happen then is, as far as data is concerned, is that you will be asked to use an alternative data repository. However, you will be asked to create a metadata record within Kikapo. So in other words, you'll create a record in Kikapo and provide a link to where your data is being stored. Okay, as far as everybody else is concerned, for let's say the humanities faculties, for example, or the social sciences, any of the data that you collect, a large percentage of that is going to be very small, and those can be stored in Kikapo. Okie dokie. Let's just have a look and see if there are any other questions. Okay, someone would like to know what the difference is between REDCap and Figshare. Figshare is a service provider that provides the software on which Kikapo is based. So Figshare would be a data repository storage facility, as well as a data publishing facility. REDCap is what we refer to as a data or a research data productivity tool. And what this means is that an entire research project, including the collection of the research data, can be created and stored within REDCap. The facility itself also can collect all kinds of correspondence between the principal investigator, other participants in the project, and as well as provide information, as well as provide a platform for data storage and analysis. REDCap, however, is not a distribution facility. What this means is that you can manage your research project and store your research data within REDCap as a platform, but you cannot publish it. Publishing your research data would then require a platform such as Figshare, and in our case, what is known as Kikapo. So Figshare is basically software, and Kikapo, in our case, is the actual facility that uses the Figshare software. Okay, one thing to bear in mind is that REDCap was originally designed to use in the health sciences field, and the information, the manner in which the software was being set up is such that it largely focuses on the kind of research and the kind of data collected in the health sciences field. So it's important to make that distinction. It is not everyone who can actually use REDCap efficiently or effectively. Okay, it looks like we've exhausted the questions. So let's move forward. As far as my presentation is concerned, my preference is to use live presentation. So we're going to move forward and we're going to discuss the creation of the data management plan. What I'm going to share first is I'm going to show you where to find the resources that we've created in order to assist you. So I'm going to share my screen. And yeah, we'll share this one. Okay, for those of you who are interested, this is the DIRISA page. URL is DIRISA, dirisa.ac.za. You're welcome to have a look at it for further if you're interested in getting, if you're interested in finding out more information about it. Okay, so for the first part, what I'm going to do is to start at the library website. And what we're going to look at here is the subject guides that we are responsible for. As far as the library webpage is concerned, it's lib.uwc.ac.za. What you do is to click on the first picture on the left, which is students. There is a link in terms of research and postgraduate students as well, but it's the same page we're going to. So just to go back, we click on students. We then select subject guides. And the list of subject guides available are guides that are faculty specific. In the case of the library, for this training, we are looking at library research tools on the right. And here we have a couple of guides that we are responsible for, not all of them. So here we have open access and avoiding predatory academic practices. So this one is about predatory journals. We also have selecting a journal to publish your article. And then we have a research data management guide. And this is the one particularly useful for this course, well, for this training session. So as far as the overview is concerned, what we're going to do is we're going to use this guide, and then we're going to move over to the actual construction of a data management plan. So Sarah's gone through the first part, which essentially is research data, what it is and how it works. She's mentioned the FAIR data principles, which are listed here. So data needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These have a bearing on how you create or develop your research data, your data management plan. We have a list of the UWC repositories. So Kikapo is available here. And then there are two introductory videos that explain Figshare as a repository and that explain upload, and one that explains uploading data to Kikapo. So we'll get to that a bit later. We also have a repository on Zenodo, and we have two videos explaining how Zenodo works. Okay, so we'll get to data management planning in a bit. At the bottom on the left, we have useful tools and resources. We have a UWC data management plan template. There is a link for an interactive template or an active one, which I will share with you. Here we have this NRF statement on open access, and what the NRF, the National Research Foundation statement basically says is that if you were funded by public funds, including that of the National Research Foundation or any other fund that is considered public, then you have to make sure that your data or your supporting data is made available or accessible. And we'll get to that soon. We have, this one is the link for the FAIR data principles. We also have open access and FAIR data principles that explains the relationship between open access and FAIR data. And then towards the bottom, we have the DIRISA website. And then here we have something called the DMP Online. And this is something we will look at in a minute. We have a DMP Online webinar, which was related to the DMP. It was a webinar that discusses the use of using a DMP Online. This one is the data curation lifecycle model. It is a fairly complex model, and I should say that Sarah's model is a little bit easier to deal with. Okay, here we have a DMP checklist, which helps you identify whether or not you've included everything that needs to be included in your data management plan. Here we have elements of a data management plan. This one is typical data management plan components. And then at the bottom, we have data management planning workshops. This is a workshop that has happened before. The details themselves we'll get to a little bit later. This particular workshop will not be too different to this particular workshop that's been mentioned here. Okay, as far as the rest of this guide is concerned, why share your research data? Sarah has already gone through that. Aside from the fact that you are mandated to share your research data in terms of being publicly funded, it does provide a return on investment. However, it also encourages further discovery. One of the things that's important to remember is that as researchers, one of the things that we often think about is that when we create our own research, create a new project and collect research data, one of the things that is not always clear to a researcher is the fact that you are already using someone else's data. When you've done your literature review and it helps produce, and it helps you collect and it helps you shape your research project. What is happening there is you're using an article that is based on some research data previously collected. So the idea is that as far as your research is concerned, you're welcome. You are also then encouraged to continue sharing your research so that it continues to build a scientific record. Okay, here we've got two short videos with regard to research data. One of them is research data, and the other one is the knowledge lifecycle that you can have a look at your own time. Here we've got the data management planning and how it works, and we will go through that now because this directly impacts how you create a DMP. DMP being data management plan. Okay. What I would like to do is to pause for a minute and have a look at any questions. Let's see. The RDM policy applies to, yes. The RDM policy doesn't only apply in terms of research being publicly funded. The RDM policy applies to all research being conducted, whether it's a student research project or an academic research project or any project at the university that requires the collection of some form of data. Okay, so yes, that includes master's students. It includes undergraduate students who are collecting projects as well as doctoral students and postdoctoral students. Is there a different way that qualitative and quantitative data are managed? No, not in terms of creating a data management plan and not in terms of creating, not in terms of uploading or storing your research data. Okay, so moving forward, what we're going to do is to have a look at the data management plan and the basic components of a DMP. So what you have here is the first part is your data description, what is going to be collected, how it's going to be collected, and who your intended audience is, so for whom. Access and sharing, we'll discuss how will the data be stored and accessed, and whether or not there are any restrictions, as Sarah mentioned earlier. Metadata, which metadata standards will be used. Metadata is just a description of your data. It is not really important. It's important to remember that there are different types of metadata schemes. Essentially, this refers to the different types of jargon that is used with regard to the different fields. So it's not a big deal to be very, very precise when it comes to the metadata scheme that is being used. Okay, intellectual property rights, who owns the data? And are there any copyright or funder restrictions? As far as the intellectual property rights are concerned, not all research projects collect data from scratch. Data can be used from another project or another facility of some kind. So for example, the city of Cape Town has a data management portal where they load all kinds of data that are collected based on various municipal activities. That data is publicly available and can be used in terms of any research project. So that was just one example of using someone else's data. Okay, your ethics and privacy section, how will consent be obtained and how will subjects be protected? This is where the Protection of Personal Information Act comes in. There is a section under the Protection of Personal Information Act that does deal with research data collected from a data subject and in this particular case, we are referring to the data subject where the data subject is a person, a human being, whether or not they are, irrespective of their age, so whether or not they are minors. Okay, we'll get to that again soon. Format, as far as Sarah did mention, that your format needs to be a publicly accessible format. We do have problems with some data formats that either where the project, for example, is a long-term project and the format itself or the software being used in terms of the actual data collection is such that as far as the data is concerned, the software goes out of date. And what that means then is the data that was produced or collected using that particular format eventually just doesn't become available or useful in any way. So this is why Sarah mentioned that your data format does need to be publicly accessible. However, as far as the DMP is concerned, it is also important to make sure that you identify the software that you are using and the data format, as well as the version that you are using. Okay, so archiving and preservation, what are your long-term storage plans and what are the backup plans? This question can be a little more complicated, and one of the things that we do need to remember is that a DMP is an administrative document, and while it needs to be created at the beginning of the research process, in fact, a decision was taken recently or supported recently at the Higher Degrees Committee that when a student hands in the research proposal, that a data management plan accompanies the research proposal. The effect of that process is that you will need some kind of data management plan. You may not necessarily answer all of the questions immediately, or you may not be able to answer all of the questions immediately, but there will be, but it's important to show that there is an attempt to manage the research data. So in terms of archiving and preservation, what you could say, for example, is that your data is going to be stored for a particular period of time. In most cases, the standard period is 5 years, and whether or not there is a backup plan of any kind. With regard to Kikapo or our research data facility, we are dependent on Figshare to create backups of our research data or backups of our research data facility. In terms of the retention period, you need to indicate how long data will be stored. As I said earlier, the standard period is 5 years before the data needs to be destroyed. As far as the research data is concerned, there are some concerns about the period for which data needs to be stored, but this is something that remains under discussion. And for now, as far as retention is concerned, the basic period is 5 years. We then have resources and responsibilities. Which resources are required and who is responsible for what? As far as data management plans are concerned, it is important to identify all of the participants with regard to the research data. So in other words, not only the principal investigator, but who is collecting the research data, who is responsible for data analysis. When it comes to significantly large projects, it may be prudent, or we may find that as far as the researcher is concerned, you may want to outsource the function as far as your data storage and analysis is concerned. You need to identify who those people are and who are going to work with the research data. As far as your resources are concerned, some budgeting may be required. Some budgeting may be required in terms of the research data itself. This would be things like various costs involved as far as the research data is concerned. So when it comes to the research data, not just the software, but also the machines that you're going to use, so a laptop, for example, and a storage, a backup hard drive, but also a service as far as, so if you choose to outsource your data analysis, you could include the cost of the service as well. As I said earlier, the data management plan is a fluid document, so it will change as the research data develops. Okay, as far as the guide goes, we'll just, at the bottom, we have citing research data. So here we have how to cite research data, and how to publish research data. And of course, there's a short guide as well. Just to be clear, my contact details are below, are in the little box at the bottom. Okay, let's just have a look at the chat quickly. We'll see if there are any questions. As far as the data is, as far as the slides are concerned, and the recording of this, and the recording of this workshop, it will be made available. Okay.
Can I quickly jump in here?
Yes, Sarah.
Somebody's just messaged me privately, but I think it's worth responding to everyone. Someone asked if the DMP isn't completely correct, will the ethics approval be delayed? This is a new field. It is a new field, and that's why, you know, there are all these questions of people saying, will this impact my submission and whatnot? I mean, there is this interim period of communication, and everything was always to be expected. So in cases of research having personal subject information, supervisors will likely already have advised their researchers on how to be POPIA compliant. But from later this year, the research ethics committees will include a necessary data management plan to get research ethics approval. This is obviously far more pertinent to the biomedical research ethics committee, because that always involves personal subject information and it's health information. But it will inevitably be all of the RECs, although this is obviously different levels of information in the DMP. I hope that helps.
Sorry, can I also just jump in for a quick point? In the Research Ethics Committee forms that you fill in already, or HSS Rec, or whatever form it is, depending on your faculty, there is a section there on data management already. And so what we'll probably see in the future is that might be extended, or you might have to have an appendix including a more detailed data management plan. So at the moment, there is just a paragraph on that in your ethics form. So it's not that you don't have that yet, you do still have it. It's just perhaps adding a bit more detail in future. So for those of you who have already got clearance, you probably won't have to adjust that significantly.
Okay, thank you. And so let's just go ahead quickly. I agree. As far as the research ethics is concerned, yes, there is, people will be concerned, and you are, and I understand in terms of the delay with regard to ethical approval. Please bear in mind that help is available in terms of developing a data management plan. Let's see if you're, so we have another question. We had a question in terms of Kikapo versus Zenodo. With regard, let me answer you this way. As far as data being restricted is concerned, Kikapo can do that. We don't have a problem with that. As far as the administration is concerned, as I said, I'm the administrator. As far as data is concerned, we can keep it closed. And that will not be a problem. It can be shut down to the extent that no one actually knows that it's there. What is important about storing your research data is concerned, is that we do need to find a way to make sure that you don't lose any of your research data, and that your data is not compromised in any way when not stored in an appropriate facility. With regard to Zenodo, Zenodo is a free platform that is available. And this is the difference between Kikapo and Zenodo. With Kikapo, we basically pay for it as far as Figshare is concerned. So when it comes to the university, we can make various various provisions can be made and catered for with regard to Kikapo. We can, for example, indicate to Figshare that there are things that we do not want to be made public, and they will do that for us. Or as far as the software is concerned, we can ask them, for example, to add a terabyte in terms of storage facility in case someone needs a greater amount of storage. We don't have that kind of control over Zenodo. To the extent, so when it comes to Kikapo or Figshare as a service that we pay for, we can hold Figshare accountable if something happens or something strange goes wrong with regard to data possibly going missing from the platform. With Zenodo, because it's a free service, as I said, we don't have a lot of control over it. We don't have curatorial function or curatorial control over the data that gets uploaded to Zenodo. So I would exercise caution in terms of using Zenodo, especially for something or for data that needs to be kept private. So to answer the question, as far as Kikapo or Zenodo is concerned or are concerned, data that needs to be kept private, the best thing to do is the best place for it is Kikapo. Okay. Research ethics. There's a question with regard to research ethics committee. Says, I'm sure your supervisor has advised on POPIA. Sorry, I think that was Sarah. So that's fine. Okay. Okay, Sarah, thank you very much for responding. Okay, so let's move forward onto the data management planning. So there are a couple of things I'm going to show you first. So one of them is the DMP Online. And that. Okay, so the DMP Online is something that is produced by the Data Curation Center. Apologies for that. So as far as the DMP Online is concerned, it is an online platform where you can use in order to help you build a data management plan. Bear in mind that this platform is going to store your data management plan at some point, and there are workshops that will help you identify what to do and how to do it. However, it can be particularly complicated. One of the advantages for this platform is, in fact, the public DMPs, where you can have a look at what a DMP looks like that someone else has produced. Okay, let's just go back again. So the data curation lifecycle is the document that I mentioned earlier. It is a fairly complicated one. We won't go into details, but this is what the data curation lifecycle looks like. And it does follow the basic principles of collecting research data, analyzing it, making it available publicly, and disposing of it. You're welcome to have a look at the details, but this is a poster that is available. It's been put out by the Digital Curation Center. My apologies, as I had mentioned earlier, Sarah's lifecycle model was actually easier to understand. Okay. So let's move on. We'll go to the DMP checklist. These are PDF documents and they are available online. Okay, so the DMP checklist is as follows. We're just going to go through the broad sections first. We have administrative data at the top. And a little bit further down, data collection. So details with regard to the collection of data. We have documentation and metadata. ethics and legal compliance, storage and backup, selection and preservation. We'll go into the details soon. Data sharing, responsibilities and resources. Okay, so going back to the top, what you'll see is, so the DMP, the address is available at the top here. Let's just make that a little bit easier for everyone. Okay. So as far as administrative data is concerned, bear in mind that you have to identify the institution. We have to identify the individual as well. So the investigator. We have to identify the funder, grants reference number, project name and description, etc. The UWC template is based on this document. At this point, I suggest we go over to the UWC template because it's simpler to use. Okay. What's important to remember with regard to the DMP template is that the UWC template is a lot easier to look at. And as I said earlier, it is something that that needs to be edited in. It is unique for each project and it may be edited and refined. Okay. So the UWC template looks like this. Can somebody just let me know that they can see it, please? Or see it clearly. You can see it. Okay, thank you.
Can you maybe just zoom in a little bit so it's easier to...
And let's go with, okay, is that better?
Yeah, better, thanks.
Okay, so just to be clear, I'm going to make sure that everyone has this address because this is something that, so anyone with this link can use it or can view the template. So let's just go to a little chat box. And you're welcome to have a look at it at any time. You're also welcome to download the chat book, to download this template as well. Before we move further, and thank you very much for your interest. I see quite a few people have logged on. Okay, before we move further, we have the UWC DMP template here. However, on the first sheet on the left, we have the University of Michigan template. And here we have various, this is a very simple version of the DMP. It is not simple in terms of what your DMP is going to look like. It is simple in terms of the descriptions that you need, that are required. So when you fill it in. So in the box where it says details, that is where you put your details. The link at the top is where the original page is. So on the left, we have a data description, which is a description of the information being gathered, and the nature and scale of the data that will be collected. So the nature and scale of the data to be collected refers to the format as well as the anticipated size of size in terms of storage. Okay, here you would indicate, for example, existing data. So if you are looking at a data that is being collected elsewhere, it's important to remember that you need to record the location of that data. We have format, as Sarah mentioned earlier, you need a publicly retrievable format. However, you do need to provide a description of the data format as well as the software that you've used and the version of the software that you've used. Your metadata is a description of in this case, you have a description of the metadata that you have used. So in other words, if you have used Dublin core metadata, we will discuss the metadata field soon, then you will indicate that you have used the Dublin core metadata field or metadata scheme. If you have used a metadata scheme that is unique to your field of expertise, then you need to identify that field. Okay, storage and backup. This indicates where you're going to store your data and what your backup plans are. As far as the storage is concerned, if you're going to store your data anywhere, you need to indicate where it's being stored. In our case, you will indicate Kikapo or Zenodo. or you will indicate that your data is being used that you are using data that has been stored elsewhere, or you're using an existing data set that has been stored elsewhere. So in other words, the existing metadata, the existing data at the top, what you filled in there, if you have used someone else's data, you'll put it here as well. If you're using obviously your own unique data, then you will not fill in the existing metadata field, the existing data field. Security concerns would be things like technical procedures in terms of how you deal with confidentiality of information, how you deal with permissions, etc., and whether or not there are any restrictions or embargoes required. Here you would have responsibilities. So here you'd have names of individuals as responsible for the data management of the research. In this case, it would include the principal investigator, but as well as any outsourced people that are going to help. So in this case, if it's a larger, let's say a national research project, you would have a principal investigator and you will list all of the details of all of the individuals who are participating in the project, as well as people who are analyzing or storing the research data. Okay, intellectual property rights. This is where you would indicate any kind of legislation that is applicable to your project. For most of us these days, that will be the Protection of Personal Information Act. But you also need to indicate whether or not anybody owns the intellectual property. So if you have used an existing data set, so in other words, you've used a data set, let's say from the Western Cape provincial government, they would own the intellectual property with regard to the data. When it comes to collecting research data for a research project, especially for students at UWC, please bear in mind that the university owns the data. We can get into a little bit of a discussion about that, but it is important to understand that as far as students are concerned, when you collect data for a research project, the university does own the data. Okay, access and sharing. As far as access and sharing is concerned, this is where you would indicate what kind of storage facility you are using. If your data is going to be published or has been published, you can add the DOI to it to make sure that the data, to explain that the data is going to be made public. And then in terms of sharing or embargo periods, you can indicate for how you would share your data. So sharing your data would be through a data facility, a research data storage facility, such as Kikapu, as well as indicate the number of whether or not an embargo period is applicable. And an embargo period is something that is a period of time that allows for exclusive privilege. What that means is that your data will become available after a particular period of time. As far as research projects are concerned, if you're writing a paper from your thesis, we will allow, as the library or as the university, we will allow you 12 months of exclusive use. So what that means is that you will have 12 months to complete your book or chapter or publication or conference paper, etc. Whereafter the expectation is that your data will become public. Of course, this is also dependent on whether or not your funder agrees. Your intended audience is important. As far as selection and retention periods are concerned, you can identify which part of your data can be made public and for how long you are going to store it. As far as selection is concerned, we do not publish raw data. We only publish refined and sanitized data, or data that is appropriate for public consumption. And bear in mind, in terms of public consumption, once the data becomes public, anyone can use it. So it is important as far as your data is concerned to be clear on which part of your data is going to be made available. Archiving and preservation, this one is fairly straightforward, where your data is going to be stored and what kind of succession you have for data. Should the archiving entity go out of existence? This essentially is just a backup plan. Then we have ethics and privacy. We're still looking at the University of Michigan template. The UWC template contains all of this information. This one is just a little bit easier to read. So as far as ethics and privacy is concerned, here you would have here you'd indicate whether or not you have ethical approval. As far as the budget is concerned, you'd be able to indicate here what kind of costs are involved in terms of your data, collecting your data, archiving it, and whether or not funding has been made available. In some cases, a funder may not be clear on whether or not you could spend any of the money on collecting or storing research data. The data organization. How will your data be managed during the project? What kind of information you're going to use? What kind of information is required in terms of the version control and naming conventions? Sarah did touch on naming conventions as well, to make sure that your files are labeled in such a way that the information they contain are clear. We have quality assurance. So again, procedures for ensuring the data quality during the project, and then legal requirements. So any kind of legislation needs to be listed as well. Okay, so let's just move forward. So this is the University of Michigan template. It is very easy and very simple to use, but let's move on to something a little more complicated. This template is the checklist for the Data Curation Center from Edinburgh. This one is a 2013 document. It is still being used as a 2013 document. So as far as the link is concerned, you can have a look at the latest version if there is one. The last time I checked was a week ago, and this document was the 2013 document was still available, or at least was still being used. This checklist is a far more comprehensive one, but it does contain quite a few, and it does contain information that, for example, the University of Michigan template does not. However, the broader sections make this one a little bit easier to use. So at the top, you have administrative data. Then you have the identity. So identity of either the funder, the institution. We need to identify the researcher down here. So the principal investigator, the ORCID, details of the project, contact details, and the first version of the DMP is important. So the date that the first version of the DMP was created is important. And the reason for that is the DMP is something that can change as your DMP was changed, as your project progresses. And here we've got the update. As far as this box goes, it was the date that the DMP was last changed. So in other words, it will indicate the difference between the first version and the last version of the DMP, or the most recent one. Some of the other sections here would be funder, who the funder is. If there's a grant number, indicate the grant number. As far as the project, the name of the project is concerned, it needs to be clear. The project description it says a brief summary of the project itself. If you've already written an abstract, for example, that can go there. And then we have the principal investigator. A little bit further down, we have data collection. What kind of data will you collect? So what kind of format you're going to use? What is the volume of the data you expect? Does your chosen format and software, for example, enable sharing and long-term access? So in other words, the description, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of your long-term access to the data, it's important as far as the format is concerned that it remains a retrievable format, even over a longer period of time. As far as research is concerned, we have come across projects where the software and the software format was unique to a particular project that does not exist anywhere else, which means that if you were not the principal investigator, you will not be able to access the data or much of the research project for that matter. You also have, you also need to indicate how the data will be collected or created. Okay. Later on, you will have a look at documentation and metadata. What is important about the documentation and the metadata is associated documentation needs to be clear on why the data is being collected, how it was organized, and how you expect to use it. This part of the project, or this part of the DMP, makes it clear to users why you have used your data in a particular way, and it does support how you come to various conclusions. It's also important to share that information with prospective users who may use the data differently. This is to make sure that if your research is repeatable, and it should be, that anyone using your data has to use it in the same way to reach the same conclusions. Otherwise, they could potentially say that your data is faulty, or your research or your conclusions or assumptions are faulty, or are based on faulty data. Okay, so we have ethics and, my apologies, ethics and legal compliance to consider. So consider how your data is being stored. Oops. So we have ethics and legal compliance. Again, mentioned whether if you have received ethical approval, it will go along. You'll have to attach the ethical approval document. Someone's microphone is on. And then, as far as data is concerned, in terms of intellectual property, identify who owns the data and what your license is for reuse. Licensing is something that we can discuss at a later stage, but licensing essentially is a statement that indicates how you would like your data to be used after you are done with it. Okay, storage and backup. This is where you would indicate how your data is being stored. So in the case of UWC, it would be Kikapu. If your data is significantly large, you may consider storing at what is this thing called in Rondebosch? The Center for High Performance Computing. It may be something that you need to store there. If it's astrophysics or astronomy, you may consider this National Observatory. What is important to remember if your data is stored elsewhere is that we do need a record of where your data is being stored. And again, if you've used someone else's data, we do need to know where the data is. Okay. How will you manage your security? What kind of security risks are there? As far as security risks are concerned, we are concerned with security leaks when it comes to personal data. And as I said, we'll discuss a little bit of the POPIA Act in a minute when we're done here. We have selection and preservation. Which part of your data must be retained? Which part must be restored? What are your contractual agreements or your regulations? And how you will decide to keep certain parts of your data. It's important to remember that as far as the data is concerned, raw data is not published, and we do try and make sure of that as far as possible. So it is important. So as far as published data is concerned, it needs to be POPIA compliant. And we do need to be sure that as far as the data is concerned, is that it does not get leaked in any way. And as far as personal information is concerned, we need to make sure that the data is completely sanitized, or one of the new terms is de-identified. Okay, for how long will you need to store your data? As far as storing your data is concerned, we recommend a minimum period of 5 years. You could indicate whether or not there's a cost involved. Okay. Then as far as data sharing is concerned, the data sharing happens through a data repository and the use of a digital object identifier, or a DOI. This is something that you will indicate in your DMP plan. If there are any restrictions from the outset, if you are looking at health sciences data, or if you are a member of the Faculty of Community and Health Sciences or SANBI, etc., but you're dealing with confidential data in some way, you will need to be aware that from the outset, your data will be restricted in some way. And it will have to stand up to fairly rigorous criticism in terms of whether or not your data can be made public. This is not something to be afraid of. As far as your data is concerned, if you're not sure about it, we will not make it public at all. Okay, we do, however, encourage storing of your data in a research data facility so that it doesn't go missing or get lost or get compromised in some way. Responsibilities and resources, as with the University of Michigan template, you need to indicate who will be responsible for the data and data management. Okay, and you can also indicate what resources you require in terms of delivery of your data, this one says what sources will you require to deliver your plan. As far as the data is concerned, delivering your plan is not delivering the DMP. Delivering the plan is delivering on the collection of it and sharing of the research data. And in this case, it does mention whether or not you require a data specialist to assist you and whether or not your repository is going to cost you anything. Okay, so that is the DCC template. So the Data Curation Center template. So they are based in Edinburgh. Just to go back to the top again, please note that this is the second worksheet and the link is available on the worksheet itself. Okay. This template is the National Research Foundation template, and it is a lot easier to look at. So here we have at the top, we have the funder, and in this case, the funder would be the National Research Foundation. Administrative data, this is where they ask you to list any kind of policies appropriate to your data. Okay, and then one of the comments that I made was we suggest identifying the registering institution, so faculty, unit, department, public, principal investigator, and other researchers involved in the project. Okay, so that would all go there. We have data collection. What will you collect? How will you collect the data or create it? Which documentation goes along with the data? Ethical and legal compliance. How will you deal with various ethical issues? And how will you manage copyright and intellectual property issues? Storage and backup. How will the data be stored and how will it be backed up? And in the case of Kikapo, as indicated, Figshare does backups for us. For larger data sets, the EWC ICS is working on something to that effect. And then how will you manage access and security? In other words, how will you share your data? At this point, what I would like to say is in terms of sharing your research data, when you do share your data, you need to share it with your supervisor or administrative head in terms of various projects, like a university project, for example, or a collaborative project. And whoever is, and anybody who participates in the project. So in other words, while the project is active, you can share it with specific people. You don't have to share it publicly though. That is another training session. We can deal with that at a later stage. But as far as Kikapo is concerned, you can share data with specific people. Okay, selection and preservation. Again, what data will be stored or retained and what will be preserved, and then for how long. Data sharing, again, how will you share your data and whether or not there are any restrictions. And then the responsibilities and resources, who is responsible for the management of the data and what kind of resources will be required. What is important about these different templates is that all of them, elements of each of them have been incorporated in the UWC template. The UWC template looks like this. Okay, so before we continue, let's just have a look and see what kind of comments have been made. Thank you, Sarah. Yes, there will be a Kikapo template at the end of the month, Kikapo workshop at the end of the month.
I think I've addressed all the questions so far, but if anyone has anything else, pop them in there.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Okie dokie. So moving on. So this one is the UWC template, to management plan template. Okay, For further details, there is a guide to research data management. This guide is the library guide for research data management that I showed you earlier. Just to be clear, that would be this document. Okay, so as far as RDM support is concerned, our contact details are available here. So for myself and for Sarah. And then moving on, as far as the data management plan is concerned, we try to make this as simple as possible, but also as comprehensive as possible. So so when it comes to the actual project itself, the first thing that we need to do is to list the faculty and department. One of the things that I suppose we should include would be research unit. Then we move on to administrative data. What we've done here is to include the project title first, registration number or grant number or project registration number. Sometimes the grant number and the registration number are different. We need to identify the funder as well as the grant number. Here we'll provide an abstract or a description of the project. As far as the abstract is concerned, we do encourage people to include the research questions. Who the principal investigator is, we would like to see an ORCID for the principal investigator. For those of you who are not familiar, an ORCID is an open researcher and contributor ID. It is a unique number for each individual researcher contributing to either publishing work or contributing to the project. So the PI will have his or her ORCID here. However, other individuals involved in the project can also be added. Okay, contact details for the principal investigator, the anticipated time frame for the research project, and then the date that the DMP was first created, and then the revised dates as well. Okay. As I said earlier, a DMP is a dynamic document. It is something that can change. So in a project where you need to add something, you can add a paragraph. You can also remove anything that you don't need with regard to these projects, with regard to the DMP, sorry. So as far as the data is concerned, we try to get the questions as simple as possible. So what is going to be collected? Describe the data and the format that you're going to use, whether or not it is raw, how your raw data will look, what your refined or cleaned up data is going to be, or de-identified data. My apologies before I forget. As you can see, this form will be refined as things develop. Okay, so when describing your data formats, identify a storage requirement or what you expect in terms of your file size and how many files are going to be required. Is your data original, or will you reuse existing data, or a combination of the data itself? Okay. Obviously, if you're going to reuse existing data, you need to list or identify where data is stored. Okay, so what kind of software you are using, what kind of version you are using, and what's also important is the operating system of the equipment that you are using. So if you're currently using Windows 10, it's important that we understand that your users are aware that you are going to be using Windows 10. For those of you who are a little bit confused about that, please note that earlier versions of Windows, in terms of the operating system, we find that when you're using, let's say, Excel, for example, that different versions of Excel read dates differently. And it also depends on your geographic location. The operating system, in terms of the computers that you are using, will have the same problem. Your dates, your geographical location will actually determine whether or not the date is recorded in a particular way. So as far as data is concerned, when we do data cleanup, one of the things that we can do, for example, is to explain how to clean up research data, or how to manage research data in terms of the actual data itself. And one of the things that's important to remember is that you do need to collect and record your data in such a way that it is understandable, irrespective of your geographic location, as well as the software that you are using. Okay, moving forward, your document. Here you'd include your legislation and various policies and guidelines. So applicable legislation, for example, would be the POPIA Act. Your institutional policy in this particular case would include the UWC Research Data Management Policy. Your metadata schema, in this case, the metadata schema is Dublin Core. I'll show you an example of that soon. It's part of the spreadsheet. And then your descriptive document in terms of how your data was collected, how it was analyzed, and how it was used, and how it is intended to be used. As I said earlier, this is the part where you explain how your data was used and supports how you came to various conclusions. If you have any kind of memorandum of understanding, it is important to include those as well, especially when it comes to defining roles and responsibilities for data collection. This is particularly important if, for example, you are using data from an NGO. We have come across cases when NGO does not necessarily have the ability to store their research data. And what we advise is that you create an MOU so that they understand that UWC will store the data on their behalf, or will store the data as part of the research project and make it available depending on whether or not they provide some kind of consent. Okay, as far as ethical approval is concerned, the first question here is, does this research require collection of personal or health-related data? This would be the POPIA Act question. And it is important to understand that if you are collecting research data, health-related research data, you need to be clear on how you manage that aspect of your research, of the data itself, especially security. So here, you'll indicate whether or not you have received ethical approval, yes or no. You need to indicate how you will obtain consent. So obviously the consent letters or consent forms from your data subject, how you will handle intellectual property issues, copyright concerns, and how you manage confidentiality concerns. What is important about this part of the data management plan is that you can add anything that you would like in terms of your description. For example, as far as the POPIA Act is concerned, you can add little bits and pieces with regard to how you are going to address the data collected from a research subject. Please bear in mind also that because I've created this document, as we move towards clarifying the best way to deal with the POPIA Act or POPIA Act, in terms of how the university looks at and manages research data or recommends management of research data, parts of this document are going to change. So I may add, for example, a number of checkboxes so that we can make sure that whoever is using a DMP does check all of the correct boxes. Okay, we also have storage and backup facilities. How would you store your data? Whether or not it's secure. If you are dealing with health sciences data, it is vitally important that you understand that you are not allowed to have your research data on a memory stick or on a laptop that you take home with you. You can get into a lot of trouble if you're found in possession of somebody's personal health data, even if that person's name isn't clear. As far as refining your data is concerned, you will need to be able to indicate where to store your refined data. Bear in mind that as far as research data is concerned on Kikapu, we can store your raw data as well as your refined data and only make your refined data available publicly. Okay, as far as sharing your data is concerned publicly, this would be, you would share your data via DOI. which is something Kikapo can produce for you. And then how you will address security and backup concerns. This is something that you will address, that Figshare as software, as a software service provides for us. These are also questions that we can help you answer when drawing up a DMP. As far as data sharing is concerned, again, are there any funder restrictions? And so does the NRF say anything in particular, or does the Human Sciences Research Council, for example, say anything particular about whether or not your funding needs to be restricted in some way? Your access to the data needs to be restricted in some way. How will your data be shared, and how will data be securely shared? So securely shared here is how you will share your data with specific people. And this is something that we can help you with as well. Kikapo has the ability to do that. Okay, and then data selection, archiving, and retention. Which data will be shared? You can indicate which percentage or which part of your data will be shared, or you can simply say only the refined and de-identified data will be shared. What is your long-term storage plan? Your long-term storage plan should not exceed 5 years, because after 5 years, you'd have to reevaluate your storage plan. I realize it's a lengthy period of time, but it is something that we can help you with as the library. And then how long is your data expected to be stored? As far as the data expectation is concerned, the minimum period is 5 years. Okay, so having said that, it is important to understand with regard to the data management plan that it describes how you will collect your research data and how you are going to store it, and whether or not you comply with various either policies or legislation in terms of whether or not the data can be made available publicly. The point behind the RDM document is to make sure that your data is that the quality of your data is recognized, and that your data can be made public. Well, part of your data can be made public. It also explains why your data cannot be made public. Okay, let's just have a look. Are there any questions so far? Okay, institutional funder policy, metadata scheme used, description document. So, yes. So Cara has asked, okay, so the questions are applicable to everyone. So as far as the institutional funder policies, metadata schema, and version being used is concerned, in your descriptive data document, yes, the documents need to be uploaded to the data repository along with your data. And yes, an MOU as well to clarify roles and responsibilities. That is true. Descriptive analysis and upload, spelling check. Yeah, we can do that. Thank you. Yes, as far as, yes, if you are in possession, the POPIA Act makes it illegal for anyone to have anyone else's personal data or personal information. I understand in the past and currently that having a data on your laptop, for example, especially your personal device, is useful. It's certainly a security feature in terms of not losing your data in any way, but it is, officially speaking, as of the 1st of July, it is illegal to have anybody's medical records or personal information available on your person. This is why the university, the international trend for research data is such that the university is regarded as the owner of the research data. If you are found to have personal data or medical records of individuals, you can be held individually responsible. and you can be charged legally as an individual. Where the university owns the research data and you acknowledge that the university owns the research data as an institution, then the university can actually protect you. So yes, and does this relate to master's students in social sciences as well? It relates to all research projects. So as far as your research project is concerned, if you are recording data that has personal information on it with regard to an individual or research subject, then yes, you should not actually be in possession of the research of anyone's personal data. We have had questions in the past, about 2 years ago, where a hospital had participated in a project, or at least students from the where students had actually used medical records or data from a hospital. And what happened after the project, about 2 years after the project, the hospital contacted the university to find out what happened to the research data and whether or not it was secure. It is important to understand that if you are working with personal data, that you do need to make sure that you don't have any copies of it. It does not mean that you surrender your data in any particular way, to such an extent that you don't have it anymore. What you need to remember is that if the data is stored in a data repository, you still have access to it and you can still continue to use it. It is just something that is not available on your person as an individual. Recorded interviews, those can be uploaded to a data repository. As far as the Kikapo data repository is concerned, you can upload any kind, or pretty much any data, any format of data, or at least any file format that is available out there. And if there's a file format that is popular that Figshare cannot handle, we can actually ask them to upload to make that possible. Okay. So, just have a look. So we've gone through the DMP template. As I indicated earlier, you're welcome to download the template itself for your own use, and you're welcome to edit it in any way that is appropriate for your project. Please bear in mind that you can approach Sarah and myself with regard to preparing your DMP. We can help you identify whether or not you're going in the right direction or have missed anything. And of course, if you would like to add something, we can do that as well. We can help you identify that you can add. Okay. What I'd like to do is to go onto the last sheet in this spreadsheet, and that is the Dublin Core metadata fields. Please bear in mind that these were created largely for libraries. But the idea behind including the Dublin Core metadata field in this spreadsheet is to help you identify or help you figure out what various terms actually mean and how they could potentially fit into your DMP. So abstract remains abstract. We will not go through all of these. For example, access rights or the rights. So in other words, who may use the information. Accrual method is manner in which an item or was added to a collection. There is a lot of information here that you will not necessarily use. Okay. What you may, for example, find useful is acknowledgement or sponsor, so organization. You may have, for example, an alternative resource. Citation, for example, would be part of that. Here you would have contributor or advisor and contributor author. So in other words, principal investigator and supervisor. You can indicate coverage, for example. So in other words, spatial or temporal topic. What this means is geographical location and time frame within which the project was created. Date of creation of the resource. So in other words, when the project starts. when the project ends. And there are a number of other little bits and pieces or terminologies that you can have, that you can use as part of this project, as part of your DMP. So the descriptions here will help. But as far as the descriptions are concerned, these are not cast in stone in any way. They're just here to help you identify various aspects that you can include in your DMP. One of the things, for example, that you can include is this one, which is, sorry, not that one, not mediator, medium. This would be the material or physical characteristics or carrier of the resource. So in other words, in this case, for a library, this would mean something printed, either printed or recorded on magnetic audio tape. But for a research project, you may, for example, want to say, or research for research data, you may need to be clear on whether or not you are collecting photographs, audio recordings, video recordings, or just normal data. Okay, so at this point, does anybody have any questions? I see there are a few. So Sarah, firstly, thank you for responding. So how regularly do we assist drafting the DMPs? We are available pretty much anytime. All things being considering the situation at the moment, you're welcome to just send us an email. Okay, as far as storage is concerned, the UWC Google Drive storage, it is safer, and certainly safer than only storing material on your hard drive. So I agree with Sarah, thank you. Yes, we are regularly available, so that's not a problem.
Mark, can I maybe just jump in and make a comment here?
Thanks, Sarah, yes.
Sorry, it's Janine.
Janine, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I think one of the questions about like, what do we do in terms of, does this relate to social sciences as well? I think it doesn't mean that you as a student can't be doing your qualitative analysis on your personal laptop. Especially at the moment when you can't go into campus and do your work in the lab or whatever. So in natural sciences, you would do more of your research in the lab rather than at home. So particularly at the moment, when you're doing research primarily at home, it doesn't mean you can't have data on your personal computer for doing that research. Am I correct there, Mark? It's more about traveling around with it, where it could be risk of getting stolen or something like that.
Yes, that's exactly what it means. A few years ago, one of our deans had lost a laptop, and along with it, an entire research project, because there were no backups. Yes, what's also important to remember is that during your research project, or while you are participating, or while you are conducting a research project, you're allowed to have data with you. But once the project is concluded, especially depending on the kind of data that you've been using, once the project is being concluded, you're not allowed to have it with you. Also, bear in mind that Kikapo is and as well as Zenodo, is a data repository. You cannot work live on your data while it is being stored in the repository. So that means that you work on your research data, you do your analysis, and you upload the various versions of your data to the repository so that you can have an example. So for example, you would have your raw data. You can upload onto the repository. Obviously, you can download it at any time as well. Then as you refine your research data, you upload the different versions of it onto the repository. But at the end of the project, it's important to make sure that all of the data that you have collected is on the repository and not on your person. As indicated, you basically should not be found in possession of anybody's personal medical history in any way. So Janine is correct. You can use it at home. while you are registered as a student and or staff member, depending, and while the project is still underway, you are allowed to have the research data, but you can only keep it with you as long as the project is still underway. Once it's concluded, the research data needs to be on the repository. Also bear in mind, as I said earlier, because the university owns the research data, it does not mean that you do not have access to it. It just means that it is on a repository where you can safely say, I personally do not have any Citizen X's medical records, but they are available elsewhere. Also, if the data is published and is available publicly, you can still use it along with anybody else who wants to have a look at it. In terms of the embargoes, I did mention in a period of exclusive use or exclusive privileged use, that is something that we can allow for a period of up to 12 months. Okay, any other questions? Janine, you might want to answer this one. How long will ethical approval take?
General ethics clearance depends on how often your ethics clearance faculty committees meet. At the moment, there is an element in the standard ethics forms, there are questions addressing data management. And so having a separate plan is not something that's currently part of the process. It's currently integrated into your ethics clearance forms. At some point, you may be required to complete a data management plan as well as and submit that as part of the process, but I don't think that's currently part of what's formally required. So it shouldn't change your duration for submission and approval.
Okay, thanks, Janine. Also, as I said, a data management plan is not cast in stone. It will change as it will adapt as your project develops. What is important in terms of ethical approval is making sure that the ethical approval or the ethical, any kind of ethical approval or concerns with regard to your research data is actually addressed. Also bear in mind that your research data is not public from as your project develops. That part only really becomes public at the end of your project. So during the process of collecting and analyzing your research data, you will have exclusive use of it. It will not be a public platform in terms of anybody can see the research data that you're busy working on. It is important to note though that as far as your application for ethical approval is concerned, is that you are clear on whether or not your data is going to be sensitive or whether or not you are going to collect any sensitive data during your project. That is something that you need clarity on. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so Nazreen says thank you. So we're almost out of time, but as indicated, you guys are welcome to, anyone is welcome to contact us with regard to creating a DMP. We're certainly able to help with developing it, with providing advice, developing a DMP as far as possible. Also bear in mind that these are not, that the templates that we provided are just that, they are templates. They are generic, whereas a DMP for a particular project is unique to that project. So we can help you develop your own DMPs. As you've seen, they can be fairly simple and straightforward, and they can actually be fairly complicated as well. My suggestion is that you try and find a balance or find a suitable template that is appropriate for your needs. And as Janine has indicated, as far as ethical approval is concerned, there are data management plan questions when it comes to the ethical approval as well. So there is some guidance available elsewhere and from us as well. So For there, I'm going to stop there for now. And I believe there was one more question. Okay. Are there any other questions?
I just maybe make one more comment. I think for the students especially, I just want to reiterate, this isn't something that's completely brand new. This is something that essentially is taking a lot of what you've got in your research proposal and in your ethics clearance documents, taking the things related to what data you're collecting, how you're collecting it, and how you're storing it, and putting it in a nice, concise document that you update as you're going along. So this isn't something that's completely foreign or completely new. This isn't a whole new thing that you're doing. It's just putting it in a slightly different format, which will actually help you when it comes to writing up your final thesis to document exactly what you've done. You've got that there nicely. So this isn't completely new and scary. It's just a slightly different format from what we might have done before.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Janine. And Sarah, thank you very much for your help.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And we will make the recording available. I'll send out, we'll send out an email with the presentations and the recording soon.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.